What if everything you've been told about yourself is only a simplified model, a useful one, a functional one, but incomplete? What if the most important aspect of who you are cannot be directly measured, isolated, or even fully described? And what if ancient civilizations were not naive in believing in the soul, but were, in some sense, observing something real through a different framework? For most of modern history, the dominant view of the human being has been biological. We are bodies, complex systems of cells, electrochemical processes organized into networks we call the brain. Thoughts are neural activity. Emotions are biochemical responses. Memory is encoded in synaptic patterns. This model is powerful. It explains a great deal, but it does not explain everything. For example, why does subjective experience exist at all? Why is there something it feels like to be you? This is known in modern philosophy as the hard problem of consciousness. We can describe how neurons fire. We can map brain regions. But the transition from physical processes to inner experience remains unexplained. Ancient civilizations approached this question differently. They did not begin with matter. They began with experience. In ancient Egypt, the concept of the soul was not singular. It was composite. The Ka represented life force. The Ba represented personality and mobility of the self. The Ach was a transformed, transcendent state. This was not primitive thinking. It was an attempt to map different layers of human experience. In ancient Greece, philosophers like Plato proposed that the soul is not produced by the body, but temporarily inhabits it. In his dialogues, he described knowledge as recollection, not learning something new, but remembering something already known. Eastern traditions, particularly in Hindu and Buddhist philosophy, the self was seen not as a fixed entity, but as a process, a flow, something that evolves, transforms, and reconfigures across time. Different cultures, different symbols, but a strangely consistent intuition that human identity is not limited to the physical structure of the body. So how do we interpret this? Were ancient people simply projecting meaning onto the unknown? Or were they describing real phenomena, language? Let's consider a modern analogy. Think of the human brain not as a generator, but as an interface, a receiver, a processor. This idea, sometimes called the receiver theory of consciousness, suggests that the brain does not create consciousness, but filters it. Much like a radio receives signals that already exist in the environment. From this perspective, the soul could be interpreted not as a mystical object, but as a broader field of awareness, of which the brain is only a localized access point. Is there any scientific basis for such a hypothesis? Not directly, but there are intriguing hints. In neuroscience, we know that perception is not a direct reflection of reality. It is a reconstruction. The brain filters out most sensory input. It constructs a simplified model of the world. In physics, we know that what we perceive as solid matter is mostly empty space. Atoms are not solid objects. They are probability distributions, energy fields. So already our intuitive understanding of reality is incomplete, filtered, constructed. Now consider this. If the brain filters reality, what might it be filtering out? Ancient traditions often suggested that ordinary perception is limited, that there are layers of reality beyond what we normally experience. This is where the idea of the soul becomes interesting again, not as a thing inside the body, but as a perspective, a level of awareness not constrained by the usual filters. Have you ever experienced a moment when your sense of identity shifted, not disappeared, but expanded? Moments of awe, standing under a vast night sky, looking at the ocean, experiencing something so large that your usual sense of self becomes less central. Psychologists call this self-transcendent experience. It is measurable. It correlates with changes in brain activity, but its meaning is still debated. Ancient cultures did not dismiss these experiences. They studied them, structured them, integrated them into their understanding of reality. Now let's introduce a more speculative idea. What if the soul is not a static entity, but a pattern, a dynamic configuration of information that persists through change? In modern science, we already accept that identity is not tied to specific atoms. The atoms in your body are constantly replaced, and yet, you remain you. So what persists? Not the material, but the pattern. This idea appears in multiple fields. In biology, genetic information persists through replication. In neuroscience, neural patterns encode memory. In physics, systems maintain structure through dynamic equilibrium. So, what if the soul is a higher-order pattern, not localized, not fixed, but stable across transformation? Ancient traditions often spoke of continuity beyond death. Modern science does not confirm this, but it does show that information is not easily destroyed. In physics, there is a principle: information is conserved, even when systems change form. This leads to a provocative hypothesis. What if the soul is a form of information structure, embedded in a larger system that we do not yet fully understand? Now connect this with something else: water. As we explored earlier, water is not just a passive substance. It is deeply involved in life, cognition, and biological processes. The human brain is mostly water. Cells function through water. Life emerged in water. Ancient civilizations often linked the soul with water. Not randomly, but symbolically. Water flows, adapts, changes form, while maintaining continuity. A wave is not a fixed object. It is a pattern moving through a medium. What if the soul is more like a wave than a thing? A dynamic process, a pattern of awareness moving through biological structure. This analogy may sound abstract, but it aligns with several modern ideas: consciousness as process, identity as pattern, reality as dynamic system. Now consider memory. We usually think of memory as something stored in the brain. But memory is also externalized in culture, in language, in environment. Ancient myths may function as a form of collective memory, not literal records, but symbolic encodings of experience. Stories about the soul may not be descriptions of an object, but attempts to describe an experience that is difficult to define. And this may explain something important. Why does the idea of the soul persist? Across time, across cultures, across belief systems. If it were purely fictional, we might expect it to disappear, to be replaced. But instead, it evolves, adapts, reappears in new forms, from ancient myth to philosophy, to modern discussions of consciousness. Perhaps this is not because the idea is true in a literal sense, but because it points to something that humans repeatedly encounter, something that cannot be easily reduced. Right now, as you are reading this, there is a part of you that is aware, not the thoughts themselves, but the awareness of them. This is a subtle distinction, but an important one. Thoughts change constantly, identity shifts, memories fade, but the sense of being aware remains. Ancient traditions may have identified this and called it the soul, not as a belief, but as an observation, a direct experience. So the question is not simply, does the soul exist, but rather, what exactly are we referring to when we use that word? A substance, a pattern, a field, a process, or something else entirely? Modern science does not yet have a complete answer. Ancient civilizations did not have modern tools, but both are, in different ways, exploring the same mystery, the nature of consciousness, the nature of identity, the nature of existence itself. And perhaps the most interesting possibility is this, that the truth lies not entirely in the past and not entirely in the present, but somewhere in between, a place where ancient insight and modern science begin to overlap, not as contradiction, but as different perspectives on the same underlying reality. So, what did ancient civilizations know about the soul? Perhaps not everything, but perhaps they were asking the right questions, and perhaps we are only beginning to rediscover them.